Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar about charitable solicitation registration and why charities and other entities need to register. My name is Erica Holler. I am a senior attorney here at McMurray & Shuster. I have been with the firm I've actually done 2 stints. My first was 5 years, and then I have been back for about 2.5 years. So I'm happy to be talking with you guys today about charitable registrations. As always, this is these webinars are being provided as informational only. They are not legal advice. If you do have legal questions, we of course would encourage you to seek out knowledgeable counsel who can help you provide answers specific to your own organization. So today we're going to talk about, what is charitable solicitation registration? Why is it important? What happens if you don't register? What are the repercussions? How do you determine where you need to register for your nonprofit? What documents are needed? And, just high-level details like that. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is charitable solicitation registration. Charitable solicitation registration requires in certain states that nonprofits who raise funds from the public, they must comply with certain registration requirements. All of these registration requirements are regulated at the state level, although there are federal laws that apply to the solicitations. The registrations themselves are regulated at the state level, and the requirements vary by jurisdiction. So what you see in Ohio could be totally different than what you see in Texas or California or Florida. So that's why it's important to work with an attorney or someone who is knowledgeable about each state's requirements and your organization too, so that they can help you determine where it is that you need to register. 41 states currently require nonprofits to register if they are soliciting to their residents, and 25 states require that certain information be disclosed on solicitation materials. So what that means is if you are sending a mailer or you have a website, anywhere that you are soliciting information, there are regulations as to what that disclosure should say, how it should be presented, those sorts of things. So again, here there are 41 states that require registration. Some states have absolutely no requirements, and then some states have limited registration requirements. So in order to determine what is required of each state and whether you are required to register, again, you need to look at each state specific laws. So who must register? Obviously, we've talked about nonprofits. That's very basic. If you are a nonprofit soliciting funds, you likely need to register at a minimum in your home state. It's a little more complicated now with online solicitations. Some states require, if you have a website presence and you are either soliciting indirectly or accepting donations from consumers or donors in other states, you may be required to register in those states as well. But in addition to the nonprofits, professional fundraisers and fundraising counsel are also required to register in certain states. Not only are those entities sometimes registered but sometimes activities trigger registration. So whether it be, a game of chance that you are engaging in, or if you have a promotion going on with what they call a commercial co-venture, which is a for-profit organization where they are giving funds back to your charity. So it's important to make sure that you are looking at all of that in order to stay compliant with all state laws. So, we talked about the charity needing to register in addition to a professional fundraiser and fundraising consultant. Often this is confusing for clients. They'll say, we understand that us as a charity, we need to register, but what is a professional fundraiser and what is a fundraising consultant? Generally speaking, a professional fundraiser is a person or organization who is compensated in some way for soliciting contributions on behalf of a nonprofit organization and or who has custody or control of the contributions solicited. So often if you're working with a mail clearinghouse, depending on, whether that clearinghouse is being compensated, if the money is going to that clearinghouse before it comes to the charity, they could be considered a professional fundraiser. And again, in some states, they may be required to register. Not only would they perhaps be required to register for their own organization, but some states require that there are contracts between the professional fundraiser and the nonprofit to be filed, notices, different requirements. So on the flip side, a fundraising consultant is similar to a professional fundraiser, but they are generally speaking a person who is compensated. So again, they are compensated, but rather than actually soliciting the contributions, they are doing more of a management, adversary, planning, producing, or designing of a campaign rather than the actual doing of the campaign. Also, a fundraising consultant typically does not directly solicit or hold the charitable funds on behalf of the nonprofit. So, if you're working with a fundraising consultant, you may work with them a little more on the front end of your campaign and then engage with a professional fundraiser, for the actual solicitations. And in certain states, both of those entities need to be required in addition to the nonprofit. So why is this registration important? The big theme behind these registration and really any other registration requirements that a regulatory agency may require is that it protects consumers. So in this case, it protects donors and potential donors. Many attorneys general's websites, other regulatory agencies have websites where the public can get on and check information on different charities and determine if they are what the donor deems a legitimate charity. They can see if there are any enforcement actions, investigations against the charity. It just helps the consumers or the donors feel more confident in where they are giving their money and what their money may be used for. And then the other thing is, charities can use these websites to their advantage. They can refer potential donors to these websites, for confirmation that they are complying with regulations and rules for each state. So it protects both the charities and the donors, but I would say probably most importantly, the donors. The other thing too is that donors are, just like consumers, becoming more and more educated. There are many different websites that a potential donor or donor can go to get information on a charity to determine if it is, like I said, legitimate, or if it is using money as they are advertising. Some of those, the BBB has their Wise Giving Alliance. There's a Charity Navigator, Charity Watch, all sorts of different third-party websites that donors can use to help determine. So in addition, registration, it helps protect the charity. And it just adds value to operate with transparency and accountability to the donors. So we talked a little bit about what it is and why it's important, but a lot of times what clients want to know is, well, gosh, what happens if we don't register? This seems like a lot of work, whether it be bonding or the actual forms. There are quite a few components of these registrations. So, when you're making a decision, is it, what happens if we don't register? I would say, I like to explain the ramifications in kind of two different tiers. The first being publicity issues and the second being legal issues. So of course, in terms of publicity issues, if you are a charity who is not complying with laws, obviously that can damage relationships with donors, potential donors, grant makers, which ultimately can result in lost donations. In terms of legal issues, you can incur state fines, late fees, penalties. Some states, their statutes include civil and criminal penalties against officers and directors if their organization is not registered. Also, there is the possibility of revocation of your tax exempt status, which would be detrimental to a nonprofit, and ultimately the denial of the right to solicit funds. Just for some sample enforcement, there was a case where the enforcement was 1.8 million against Help the Vets, and then another one, 187 million against Children's Cancer Fund America. There are certain charities that are a little more scrutinized, just based on the nature of what they do. And two of those are organizations associated with veterans and then also cancer. So here you'll see that they are not small penalties that can really, probably just shut down an organization. So the next question clients often have is, I understand what registration is, I understand why I need to do it, but how do I know where to register? And it can be kind of complex and confusing. So again, this is where I would recommend you reach out to counsel who is knowledgeable in this area. But the first thing you want to do is review the state statutes. And much of the analysis will depend on the definitions that are included in each state statute. So for example, what is considered a charity? What is considered a solicitation? Are there any exemptions that the nonprofit might be able to to alleviate their registration requirements? So you're going to look at the statutes. And it really just turns on, understanding what it is that the law requires, and then what it is that your organization is or is not doing. And that's kind of how you get to an analysis of whether you need to register or not. Again, I mentioned if you have an online presence or you are soliciting funds nationwide, of course, you're going to need to look at every state that has these requirements. If you are a smaller organization where you are limited to one state or a particular region, it's always a good idea to start with your home state or those immediate surrounding states that you do work with. But if you have a website, it's possible that you may need to register in states that are across country if you are soliciting donations and accepting donations from donors in those states. So another thing that we talked about with registration, there's obviously the forms. Anyone that's done any sort of registration with a regulatory agency, there's typically a form that you fill out. They have you submit a check and money to go with that. But some states also have additional requirements in addition to that just initial form. Those can include an annual report, again, registration for the Fundraising Council or the professional solicitors. There are contract requirements often in these state statutes, disclosure requirements, and then also record maintenance requirements. So if you are soliciting, the statute may require that you maintain certain documents for a certain period of time. So while the registration is important, and it's important to understand if you are required to register, just know that the requirements don't stop there. Many states have additional requirements. So, once you go through that analysis to determine where it is that you need to register or what requirements you need to comply with, we would always recommend that you document that analysis. When was it conducted? Who conducted it? And then why do you meet or not meet a registration requirement? Did you do you meet an exemption? And then we want to calendar when those renewals and filings would be required. And another thing, as you're going forward, something to consider is, have you previously registered in a state where you are now claiming an exemption? Did you let your registration lapse in a particular state for a certain period of time? What if you receive a correspondence from a state regarding registration where you either have not been registered for previously, or again, where you maybe let your registration lapse? And what do you do if you determine that you've affirmatively determined that you are no longer required to register in a certain state? So these are all considerations that you should keep in mind as you are going through your analysis. And again, document everything as much as you can. That will be the most helpful going forward. In terms of documents, not only your registration analysis, you want to keep all of those records handy. You also want to keep some things that are good to keep are the financial reports, donor list, campaign documents, tax filings, any contracts with third parties. These are all good documents that you just want to make sure that you have not only executed or filled out, but that you're maintaining those. Yeah, so that's kind of our big overview on what is charitable registration. If anyone has any questions, I would be happy to help you. And that's all we've got. Thank you very much.